A regular day at the station, just another face walking through the doors. At least that's what they thought. When a black woman enters the precinct in plain clothes, the officers see someone to dismiss, mock, and push around. But they have no idea who she really is or what's about to happen. Because she's not just another visitor. She's the new chief of police, and what unfolds next is a stunning clash of ego, racism, and long overdue accountability. This isn't just a story, it's a wake-up call. So stay with us, because the moment the truth comes out, everything changes. Let us know what time you're listening and where you're tuning in from. Drop a comment below. We'd love to hear your thoughts. And while you're here, hit like and subscribe so you never miss the stories that matter. Early that morning, the air in Hampton carried a stillness that made every footstep echo a little louder, every breath feel a little heavier. The streets were quiet, just waking up under a sky dusted with pale clouds, the kind that never promised rain, only reflection. As Alexandria Monroe turned off the ignition of her rental car, she sat still for a moment, her hands resting on the steering wheel, her dark eyes gazing at the unassuming brick building that housed the Hampton Police Department. It was her first official day as chief, but no one inside that building knew it yet. She wasn't in uniform, and she had deliberately left her badge in the glove compartment. Today, she wasn't coming in as the boss. She was coming in as a woman, black, middle-aged, alone, to watch, to listen, to feel how the place breathed when it thought no one important was watching. She stepped out of the car, the gravel crunching softly beneath her boots, her black slacks creased blazer, sharp blouse modest. She didn't walk with a flourish, but with intention, quiet, steady, measured. The kind of walk that said, "I've seen enough to not be impressed by the surface of things." The kind of walk that let silence do the talking. Her breath was calm but not without weight. There was a pressure in her chest. She didn't name something between the anxiety of what she might discover and the readiness to face it head-on. She had worked too hard, waited too long, been doubted too often to enter this role anyway, but on her own terms. She didn't want respect because of her title. She wanted to see who offered respect without knowing. As she crossed the street, a distant lawnmower hummed behind the county courthouse, and somewhere in the distance, a train horn moaned through the valley. Life in Hampton moved slowly, but the things that mattered, bias, loyalty, silence, moved in currents far beneath the surface. She knew that. She had worked enough years in cities big and small to feel the undercurrents before anyone spoke a word. The station loomed up ahead, an old building with gray paint, and a fading American flag fluttering weakly on its pole. The steps were worn in the middle, grooved by the weight of years of boots and badges of people who believed they were untouchable. She pulled open the glass door, and the familiar scent hit her immediately: old paper, stale coffee floor polish, and the faint tension of bodies that never quite relaxed. A young officer glanced up from behind the front desk, barely giving her a full look before returning to his phone. Two other officers leaned casually by the vending machine, sharing something on a screen and laughing quietly. No one asked her if she needed help. No one acknowledged her presence beyond a flick of the eyes, and that was exactly what she needed to see. She stepped inside and paused, just past the threshold, letting the door close behind her with a soft click. Her eyes swept the room not with judgment but with the quiet precision of someone who's cataloged hundreds of rooms like this before. A filing cabinet sat crooked against the far wall. A poster about opioid awareness curled slightly at the edges. A clock ticked with lazy indifference. In the corner, an older man, black like her, sat silently clasping a hat in his lap, his eyes scanning the floor like he was searching for a way to disappear. Alexandria's jaw tensed. She had seen that look too many times, the quiet endurance of a man who knew the rules were different for people like him, even if no one ever said it aloud. She approached the desk slowly, not wanting to make a scene, not needing to assert anything just yet. "Excuse me," she said, her voice low but clear. The young officer looked up again, finally meeting her eyes. He looked at her for a second too long, as if deciding what kind of woman she was. Then, he gave a faint, dismissive nod and muttered, "Yeah." The indifference in his voice wasn't shocking, it was routine, practiced. She felt it slide across her like a coat she had worn many times before. "I'm looking for someone in administration," she said evenly. "Human resources, preferably." The officer shrugged. "You got an appointment?" he asked, still half distracted by his phone. "No," she replied, "but it's important." He leaned back in his chair, his lips pursing slightly. "They might be busy." You can wait over there if you want. No apology, no effort, just a direction given without interest. Alexandria turned slightly, glanced again at the man in the corner, and walked to an empty bench nearby. She sat with her back straight, her hands resting calmly in her lap. No one asked her name. No one asked why she was there. That silence told her more than a full report ever could. And as she sat, listening to the rustle of paper, the hum of the vending machine, and the low murmurs behind office doors, she felt something settle into place within her. Not anger, not surprise, but resolve. Whatever this building was built on, whether habit or hierarchy or hate, she would face it piece by piece. And in that moment, as a beam of early sun filtered through the window and touched her shoulder, she didn't feel like a stranger anymore. She felt like the storm coming quietly to cleanse a place that had forgotten what justice really looked like. There was something about the Hampton Police Department that felt frozen in time, like a photograph left too long in the sun edges, curled, colors faded, but the outlines still clearly drawn. The walls carried the weight of decades of unspoken assumptions, and the air inside held the kind of quiet that didn't come from peace but from resignation. Alexandria noticed it. As soon as she stepped past the lobby and into the hallway, the stiffness in the posture of the junior officers, the guarded glances exchanged, when certain topics passed in whispers, the outdated plaques on the wall, honoring men who had long since retired, men who all looked the same. The carpet had been replaced, the lighting upgraded, but the culture hadn't moved an inch. It wasn't in what people said, it was in what they didn't. Down the corridor, she passed a break room door that had been propped open with a chair. Inside, 3 officers lounged in faded armchairs watching a sports show on mute, while one of them chuckled at a meme on his phone. On the wall above them, a framed newspaper clipping from the 1980s showed a former police chief shaking hands with a local judge beneath a banner that read, "Law and Order First." Alexandria paused for a moment, her eyes scanning the photo. The room had changed, but the faces hadn't. Not one officer of color, not one woman. It wasn't surprising, just quietly exhausting. She moved on her steps, silent, her presence unnoticed by most. At the end of the hallway, she reached a glass display case that housed awards commendations and a folded American flag. The case was locked, spotless, carefully maintained, but the stories behind those objects had dust on them. Protect and Serve was etched in gold at the base, but it rang hollow when you knew how protection was doled out unequally, how service came with conditions for some and unquestioned benefit for others. Alexandria's reflection in the glass looked back at her, composed, steady, but shadowed by memory. She thought of the times she'd stood in rooms like this, knowing she was the most qualified, yet treated as the least valuable. Not because of what she lacked, but because of who she was. Just then, a voice called out behind her. "You knew here." It was a woman, white mid-50s, wearing a burgundy sweater over her uniform. Her name tag read M. Kellerman. Alexandria turned, offering a polite nod. "Something like that," she replied. The woman tilted her head slightly, studying her for a beat longer than necessary. "Well, if you're looking for records, they moved upstairs. Budget stuff is still down here, though." Alexandria nodded again. "Thanks for letting me know." There was no hostility in the woman's tone, but there was distance, something cautious, like someone who'd learned long ago how to spot the different ones before deciding how to deal with them. As she made her way toward the stairwell, Alexandria passed by a bulletin board near the squad room. Tacked to the cork were announcements about charity runs, hunting club meetings, and the annual department cookout hosted at Sergeant Jennings' ranch as usual, according to the flyer. In the center was a group photo from last year's event. Jennings stood front and center, arms folded, a wide grin under mirrored sunglasses. Around him were more than 30 officers. Only 2 were black. Neither of them was smiling. Alexandria stared at the image for a long moment, her fingers brushing lightly across the edge of the frame. It wasn't just about representation, she thought it was about who felt like they belonged without having to prove they did. It was about who could show up with unshaven stubble and a crumpled uniform and still be treated like a professional, and who had to be twice as sharp just to be seen as adequate. That pressure, it didn't always show on the surface, but it lived in your spine, in your voice, in the way you learned to hold your breath just slightly when entering a room. You didn't even realize you were doing it anymore. She continued upstairs, her hand grazing the metal rail as her heels clicked softly against the concrete steps. On the landing, an older man in uniform passed her, his gaze flicking up then quickly away. He didn't say hello. He didn't even nod. And she didn't take it personally. In a place like this, silence was its own language. One she understood fluently. By the time she reached the second floor, the mood had shifted slightly. The offices were smaller, the walls bare, the energy more administrative than performative. A coffee machine gurgled in the background and a distant printer whirred out forms no one had asked for. She stood at the edge of the hallway, breathing in the smell of copier toner and floor wax. For a moment everything felt still. She wasn't the chief right now. She wasn't even a visitor. She was a mirror held up to a place that hadn't looked at itself in years. Outside the window at the end of the hallway, the branches of an oak tree moved gently in the wind, casting shifting shadows on the tiled floor. Alexandria watched them sway for a few seconds, then turned away. The tree would keep moving whether the people inside this building did or not. The waiting area just inside the main lobby was a square of faded tile and flickering fluorescent lights, where time moved slower and civility depended entirely on the uniforms behind the desk. Alexandria stepped quietly into the space, her shoes brushing against scuffed linoleum, the kind that had once been white, but now held the dullness of years walked over without care. The front desk stretched long across one side, its glass smudged, and its countertop cluttered with forms, takeout coffee cups, and a cracked radio playing soft country music. Two officers stood behind it, one thumbing lazily through a clipboard, the other tapping his phone like the world outside it didn't exist. Neither looked up. No greeting, no recognition. Just the hum of disengagement wrapped in bad-shaped authority. Alexandria stopped a few feet short of the desk and took in the room not with alarm, but with the slow, deliberate calculation of someone trained to read environments more than people. A worn bulletin board sat crooked on the far wall, plastered with overlapping flyers for lost dogs, church fundraisers, and outdated firearm certification schedules. To her left, a metal bench lined the wall, and on it sat an elderly man, black, neatly dressed, holding his hat in both hands like it might fly away if he loosened his grip. His eyes were cast downward, his spine slightly bent, but there was no sleepiness in him, only silence, the practiced kind worn into the bones by repetition. She nodded to him, as she passed a subtle gesture of acknowledgement, not expecting a response. He glanced up briefly, eyes meeting hers for only a second, and in that moment something unspoken passed between them, something heavy like history. He had been waiting a while. She could see it in the way his fingers fidgeted, his left shoe tapping ever so faintly against the leg of the bench. But no one had come. No one had asked. No one had offered him anything but the chair. She approached the desk slowly, letting her presence be known not by voice but by proximity. The officer on the phone finally looked up, his gaze sliding over her with the casual assumption of someone who thought they'd seen this before. His uniform fit loosely around a slouched frame, and his eyes held none of the curiosity that makes for real public service. "Yeah," he muttered, voice, flat lips barely moving. She gave him a calm look, even and measured. "Good morning. I'm here to speak with someone in HR." There was no urgency in her tone, no demand, only clarity. The officer blinked, once tilted his head, then responded with a shrug. "You got an appointment?" She paused, offering the faintest trace of a smile. "Number? Just a few documents to sign. Shouldn't take long." The man returned to his phone without comment, tapping his screen a few more times before gesturing half-heartedly toward a clipboard on the far end of the counter. "You can wait. Somebody might come down." And that was that. No name, no effort, just static and indifference wrapped in a badge and a tired uniform. Alexandria stepped aside and took a seat on the bench opposite the elderly man. He didn't speak but shifted slightly, making space for her as if to say, "I know how long the wait can be." She sat with her back straight, hands resting on her lap, her breath measured and unhurried. It wasn't the first time she had been made to wait in a room like this, but it was the first time it had happened while she technically outranked everyone in the building, and still she said nothing. Not yet. The silence stretched. The radio droned. A stapler clicked somewhere behind a glass office door, and a young officer walked past, holding 2 coffees but offering no eye contact. It wasn't overt cruelty. It was the kind of disregard that only grows in spaces where power is hoarded, and respect must be earned twice as hard by some. She watched the clock on the wall tick its way toward 9:17 each minute, a reminder that she was deliberately being kept small because the people here had no idea how large she could stand. Across from her, the elderly man cleared his throat quietly, but with enough force to suggest patience running low. She leaned slightly toward him, just enough for the gesture to feel warm, not invasive. "How long you been waiting?" she asked. His eyes lifted again, slower this time, the corners of his mouth tightening into something between a smile and a wince. "Almost an hour," he said, voice low but clear. "Just trying to get my son's report released. They keep saying come back tomorrow." Alexandria nodded gently. "That sounds familiar." He looked at her a moment longer, then gave a slight chuckle. "You new in town?" "In a way," she replied. "Just getting a feel for the place." He nodded once knowingly, then looked back down at the floor. That was all. No small talk, no stories. Just recognition. Two people used to waiting. Two people used to being seen second. The door behind the front desk creaked open, but no one emerged. A breeze slipped in from somewhere, carrying with it the faint scent of dust and pine cleaner. Alexandria closed her eyes for half a second, letting the air move past her like a warning and a whisper at once. She didn't need to force anything here. The truth was already speaking, it just needed someone who knew how to listen. And so she sat motionless, except for the slow rise and fall of her breath, her eyes open, her senses clear, the silence no longer empty, but echoing with everything this place had just told her without saying a word. The sound of boots striking the tile came sharp and sure, not hurried, but purposeful, echoing just enough to make people look up. Alexandria Monroe didn't turn her head, not right away. She had already felt the shift in the room's atmosphere, the tension that coiled just beneath the surface like static before a storm. From the corner of her eye, she could see him approaching, tall and broad-shouldered, his navy uniform crisp, his chest puffed out with the kind of confidence that rarely questioned itself. The name tag on his chest was visible before his face came into view. Sergeant Kyle Jennings, the name she had heard more than once in the mayor's briefings, usually spoken with a sigh. "What are you doing here?" he asked, his voice dry as concrete, devoid of welcome. He didn't bother with pleasantries or even a basic greeting, just stood there in front of her like a checkpoint she hadn't passed. His eyes swept over her, scanning her like a piece of equipment left where it didn't belong. Alexandria met his gaze, calm and unflinching. "Looking for someone in HR," she replied, her tone even clipped only by patience. Jennings let out a small laugh, not amused but dismissive, and folded his arms across his chest. "HR's a little busy today, probably not taking walk-ins. You sure you're in the right place?" The question wasn't curious, it was loaded like a riddle meant to embarrass rather than enlighten. Alexandria held his gaze for a long moment before speaking. "This is the Hampton Police Department, isn't it?" Her voice didn't rise, but the words landed with a firmness that made a few heads turn. Jennings blinked, then smirked. "Right, just checking. You know how people like to wander in thinking they have rights these days." A chuckle rose from somewhere behind him. Another officer, younger, half hiding behind a computer screen, watching and saying nothing. Jennings stepped in closer, just enough to make a point. "We've had a lot of folks coming through lately. Activists, watchdogs. People thinking they're entitled to answers." He leaned slightly forward, his face hovering within reach of confrontation. "You, one of those?" Alexandria didn't blink. I'm here for paperwork, that's all." But it wasn't all, and they both knew it. She hadn't come to play along with their script. She had come to see who they were when they thought no one important was looking. Jennings shifted his weight, clearly agitated by her refusal to shrink. "Paperwork, huh?" he repeated, his tone syrup thick with sarcasm. "You planning to apply for a desk job or just here to complain?" Alexandria took a slow breath, resisting the urge to answer with the heat he seemed to crave. "I'd like to speak with the HR team lead," she said, making each word deliberate, calm, as though refusing to speak in a raised voice was its own form of protest. He scoffed, turning to the officer behind the desk. "Hey, we got a visitor who thinks she's somebody. She wants HR. You hear anything?" The young officer didn't look up from his screen. "She can wait." Jennings turned back to her with a grin that didn't reach his eyes. "There you go. Democracy in action." Another chuckle from the shadows. The old man on the bench shifted slightly but said nothing. Alexandria felt her pulse slow, not quicken. Years of training had taught her how to breathe in moments like this, how to stay centered even when the room worked to throw you off balance. "I'll wait," she said. "I'm not in a rush." But Jennings wasn't done. "You sure you don't need the welfare office instead? We get a lot of confusion between here and the county support center." It was an insult made to sound like a joke, and it worked. Another burst of soft laughter, this time louder, more comfortable now that they'd seen she wasn't reacting the way they'd expected. She glanced toward the officer still seated at the desk, then back to Jennings. I'm here for police-related paperwork, not social services, she clarified. Her voice didn't shake, but her spine had gone stiff with something deeper than irritation, something forged through years of navigating rooms where her competence was invisible until proven with pain. Jennings let out a slow exhale as if humoring her. "Let me guess," he said. "Some kind of complaint about how you were treated at a traffic stop." The condescension landed like a slap. "No," she answered. "Not today." There was no space in her tone for misinterpretation, no thread of humor to grab onto. Jennings didn't like that. She could see it in the way his jaw tightened, how the light in his eyes narrowed into something harder, uglier. He stepped closer once more, lowering his voice just slightly. "You're awful confident for someone nobody here knows. And you're awful quick to assume you know everything about someone you just met," she replied. The words slipped out soft but clean, like a blade wrapped in velvet. For a second he was quiet. The whole room seemed to pause with him. The fluorescent light above them buzzed faintly, and in the distance a phone rang and went unanswered. He laughed, then not because he was amused, but because he didn't know what else to do with the crack in his armor. "Look, lady," he muttered, "you can sit here all day for all I care. Just don't act like you've got any say in what goes on back here." And with that he turned his back to her. Alexandria stood still, her eyes watching him as he walked away, noting the casual swagger in his stride, the way he patted another officer on the shoulder as he passed. She sat back down, but not out of defeat. Her back was still straight, her hands still calm, her gaze steady as stone. She wasn't here to react. She was here to observe, and in that brief encounter she had seen more than enough. Not just who Sergeant Jennings was, but how the room enabled him. How silence was used like cover. How laughter could be a weapon. How power, when unchecked, always showed itself in how it treated the people it believed couldn't strike back. Outside, a bird landed on the window ledge, tilting its head against the glass before fluttering away into the open sky. Alexandria didn't watch it go. She didn't need to. She already knew how to fly. The hallway leading to the briefing room was narrower than Alexandria remembered from her visit years ago, the walls now lined with outdated training posters curling at the edges, their messages faded into irrelevance. As she passed, she noticed the subtle way conversations slowed, how eyes tracked her presence without making contact, how posture shifted from casual to closed in the seconds after she stepped into view. It was the kind of environment that didn't need open hostility to feel hostile, just a shared understanding among those inside that you didn't belong unless you looked, spoke, and acted like them. And right now, to them, she was just another outsider who had wandered too far past the threshold of their control. She reached the edge of the squad room and paused, not out of hesitation, but out of deliberate choice to watch how people moved when they thought power wasn't watching them. A circle of officers had gathered around a whiteboard, pointing and laughing at something one of them had drawn in dry erase marker. Another leaned back in a swivel chair, boots kicked up on a desk, reading an incident report out loud in a mocking voice, turning someone's trauma into a punchline. In the corner, a young black officer, probably no older than 30, sat quietly taking notes, eyes flicking upward every so often, his mouth pressed into a flat line. He said nothing. He smiled at nothing. And Alexandria understood why. She stepped in further, and the air shifted. A few heads turned, some hands froze mid-gesture, the laughter thinning into a low murmur like wind passing through a crack in a wall. Someone cleared their throat. Jennings noticed, last turning only after the group's energy broke like a dropped glass. His eyes landed on her with a flicker of recognition, followed quickly by a smirk he didn't bother to hide. "Still here?" he asked, voice loud enough to reach every corner of the room. "HR must be taking their sweet time." He chuckled, as if inviting the others to join in. A few chuckled, half-hearted, uncertain now. The young black officer did not move. Alexandria looked at Jennings for a moment, her expression unreadable, then slowly approached the whiteboard. The marker was still in his hand, the drawing half wiped by someone's shoulder. It wasn't hard to guess the subject of the joke, an exaggerated figure in baggy clothes with wild hair, labeled with a name that sounded too close to Thuggy McGee for coincidence. She took one step closer and glanced at it without comment, then turned back to Jennings. "You're clearly not busy," she said, her voice calm level. "Maybe you can help me find someone who is." Jennings leaned against the board arms, crossed his body language a performance in defiance. "Lady, I told you before, you don't belong back here. You need to stay in the front until someone calls you. That's how things work." His tone was sharper now, more clipped. The smirk was still there, but it had lost its charm, replaced with something closer to challenge. Alexandria's eyes didn't waver. That may be how things have worked. It's not how they'll keep working. A hush fell over the room. One officer looked up from his desk, eyes wide and uncertain. Another shifted in his seat, like he wanted to disappear. Even the one who had laughed earlier now looked away, pretending to check his email. Jennings stepped forward again, now just a foot from her, his voice low but tight with something brittle. "Are you threatening me?" Alexandria didn't move, didn't blink. "I'm asking for the same courtesy you'd offer anyone else. Nothing more, nothing less." He stared at her jaw, twitching eyes, scanning her face like he was still trying to place her, still trying to figure out why she wouldn't back down. "You've got a real attitude problem," he muttered. "You always walk into stations acting like you own the place." Her reply was so quiet, so steady, that it landed like thunder. "Only when I do." And for a moment something cracked. Just for a moment. Not in Jennings' voice, but in the room itself, in the silence that followed, in the way no one stepped in to support him, in the way the young black officer finally looked up and didn't look away. Jennings looked around as if realizing the ground beneath him had shifted, but he wasn't sure how. Then came the laughter, not from her, not from him, but from one of the men seated at a far desk, nervous, uncertain, but loud enough to pierce the stillness. Jennings turned, glare sharp, but the damage was done. The tension had broken, and with it his grip on the moment. Alexandria stepped back then, not in retreat but in closure. She had seen what she needed to see. She turned to leave the squad room, and as she did, she felt the heat of Jennings' stare burning into her back. Not rage, not confusion, but something darker, fear. Not of her words, not of her presence, but of the way the room had changed around him when he couldn't control it anymore. She walked down the hall in silence, each footstep steady, unhurried, carrying not just the weight of the morning, but the full knowledge of how power behaves when it's challenged by presence alone. No yelling, no badge, just truth, and the uncomfortable way it demands to be reckoned with. And as she passed the display case again, that folded flag behind the glass caught a flicker of afternoon sun, casting a reflection across the hallway that danced at her feet like a quiet salute from something old that finally recognized something new. The air in the lobby had gone heavier, thicker somehow, as if the fluorescent lights themselves sensed something was about to snap. The quiet background noise, paperwork, shuffling, a distant printer, clattering, the low murmur of officers chatting near the exit began to feel artificial, like a flimsy soundtrack, masking what was really building beneath the surface. Alexandria remained, seated, her spine upright, her breath measured, her hands folded neatly in her lap, but inside her chest there was a weight that had started to pulse. She wasn't angry, not yet, but she was aware of how close everything was to tipping, how close someone in that room was to pushing just a little too far. And she didn't have to wait long. Jennings returned before anyone else dared move, striding back into the lobby like a man eager to prove something, except this time there was a sharpness to his steps that hadn't been there before. His mouth was tight, his posture wound, and when he spoke, it was with the clipped confidence of someone who had convinced himself that escalation was control. "I told you to leave," he said, his voice louder, now echoing off the bare walls. "You've been told enough times this isn't a place for civilians to wander around like they own the damn building." Alexandria stood slowly, rising from the bench with the same calm she'd held all morning, her eyes meeting his with a steadiness that made more than one officer in the room flinch. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't step forward. She simply answered, "And I told you I was here to see HR. That hasn't changed." Jennings scoffed, shaking his head, his hand waving dismissively like he was trying to physically push her out of his view. "You need to go now. This is your last warning." The word warning hung in the air, heavier than intended, echoing like something dangerous had just been unwrapped in front of everyone. Alexandria could feel it. The shift in energy, the tightening of shoulders, the silent calculation running behind every pair of eyes in the room. She wasn't the only one watching now. Several officers had stopped what they were doing. The older black man on the bench had gone completely still. One of the younger receptionists dropped her pen. "I'm not going anywhere," Alexandria said, her tone low but edged in steel. "You don't get to decide who's allowed to wait in a public lobby." Jennings stepped in closer, his body crowding into her space, and for a moment it felt like all the years of protocol and policy had vanished, replaced by something raw and primitive, a man with a badge who had never learned how to accept boundary, never learned how to deal with a woman who didn't flinch. His hand shot out and grabbed her arm rough, and sudden the move meant to intimidate more than harm, but it crossed the line just the same. "I warned you," he growled, fingers tightening, trying to turn her toward the door. But Alexandria didn't move. Instead, she looked down at his hand, not with fear, but with something deeper, something cold, disappointed and tired. "Let go," she said, her voice still composed, but unmistakably firm. He didn't let go. He doubled down. He pulled. And that's when it happened. In a single motion, reflexive and fluid, Alexandria broke his grip with the strength of someone who'd done it 100 times before, someone who had been trained, had taught others, had lived long enough to know exactly what to do when a situation shifts from verbal to physical. Jennings staggered back, half a step, surprised, embarrassed, and visibly enraged. His chest rose sharply, his fists balled, and for a second he looked around the room, not for permission, but for witnesses, then did what no one thought he would actually do. He threw a punch. The sound of it, landing a dull, brutal thud, cut through the room like a gunshot. Alexandria's head jerked to the side, her body stumbling backward, one heel catching the edge of the bench behind her. She went down hard, her shoulder hitting the floor first, her breath forced from her lungs in a single sharp exhale, and the room went completely still. No one laughed. No one moved. Even Jennings looked stunned by his own action, like he hadn't realized until that moment how far he'd let himself go. His breathing was ragged, his arms trembling with adrenaline, his expression flickering between confusion and defiance. Alexandria didn't cry out. She didn't gasp. She pushed herself up slowly, hand bracing on the bench, then rising to her feet with a kind of dignity that made the punch seem smaller than it was. The receptionist at the desk had her hands over her mouth. One of the officers by the hallway looked pale. Someone whispered, "What the hell is he doing?" But no one stepped in. No one spoke up. The room had become a museum of silence, every face a portrait of complicity. Jennings opened his mouth as if to explain, as if to justify it all, but no words came. And then Alexandria looked him dead in the eye, blood running down her lip, and said with terrifying calm, "You just assaulted someone in front of witnesses. Do you realize that?" His mouth moved, but still no sound came. He looked around the room again, this time, not for support but for escape, but there was none. Alexandria adjusted her blazer, wiped the side of her mouth with the back of her hand, and turned her head as a door behind the desk creaked open. An older man with graying hair and a stack of folders in his arms stepped into view. He froze the moment he saw her, his eyes scanning the blood on her face, the stunned crowd, and the man standing across from her with his fists still clenched. "Jesus Christ," he muttered, his folders slipping from his arms to the floor. "She's the new chief." That was the moment everything broke. Gasps erupted from the room, whispers turned to disbelief, and Jennings, who had just seconds ago stood so tall, suddenly looked impossibly small. He stumbled backward, one foot sliding on the tile, his mouth agape. "What?" he whispered. "No, that's not possible." Alexandria didn't move toward him. She didn't have to. She stood exactly where she was, in the center of the chaos, like an anchor dropped in a storm, letting the room catch up to the weight of what had just happened. Her voice, when it came, didn't rise above a normal tone, but it cut through the noise like a commandment. "Arrest Sergeant Jennings. Now." And as the officers who had watched in silence began to move, some hesitantly, some with a sense of reluctant duty, the only sound louder than the shuffle of boots was the click of handcuffs, echoing like a verdict. Alexandria didn't speak again. She didn't need to. She had already said enough. The silence that followed Alexandria's command was unlike anything the room had ever known, a silence that didn't ask for obedience, but demanded it, that settled over every badge and every collar like a cold front arriving without warning. Sergeant Jennings stood frozen, the color draining from his face as if someone had reached inside him and pulled out all the arrogance that had once filled his voice. His hands, which only moments ago had formed fists, now hovered uselessly at his sides, trembling with a strange, unfamiliar tension, not rage this time, but disbelief. He blinked rapidly as if trying to wake himself from a nightmare he had created but hadn't expected to be real. You can't be serious," he stammered, his voice a shade too high, like a man who knew the fall had begun but couldn't yet feel the impact. "I didn't know, no one told me." His words fell apart in his throat, tangled in panic and shame. Officers around him began to shift, not with urgency, but with caution, as if the air between them and the man they had once followed had suddenly become fragile, volatile. Across the room, the administrative assistant who had first recognized Alexandria rushed forward, her heels clacking across the tile like a ticking clock. "It's true," she said, breathlessly, clutching a file in both hands. "She's the new chief, appointed this week. Her paperwork's right here, I just pulled it for onboarding." Her voice cracked on the last word, as if the gravity of what had just unfolded hit her mid-sentence. She looked at Alexandria, then at Jennings, and finally at the officers, standing still, unsure. Jennings' head whipped toward her eyes, wide voice cracking. "Lisa, come on, tell them this is a misunderstanding. I didn't know who she was. I thought she was." But even he didn't finish the sentence. Because what he thought didn't matter now. What mattered was that he had acted, and everyone had seen it. Two officers, one older one, barely out of academy, stepped forward, hands twitching near their belts, eyes locked on Jennings with a mix of unease and resolve. One of them cleared his throat, his voice unsure. "Chief, do you want us to?" Alexandria turned her gaze to them slowly, her expression unreadable but undeniably composed. "Yes," she said simply. "You will follow protocol. That man just assaulted someone in custody." Her tone didn't rise. It didn't need to. The authority in it was older than the badge, older than the room, older than the system that had tried so hard to forget her. Jennings backed up a step, then another, like a man trying to retreat into the space where his authority used to be. "You're making a mistake," he muttered. "You can't arrest me. I've served this department for 17 years. But that sentence didn't carry the weight it once might have. It only echoed louder the entitlement behind it. The handcuffs clicked open with a metallic finality that made several people flinch. The younger officer looked at Alexandria again, his expression somewhere between regret and apology, then moved to take Jennings by the arm. "Turn around, sir," he said, the word stiff with inexperience. Jennings hesitated, looked around and found no one, no allies, no escape, no righteous justification to cling to. Finally he turned. The cuffs locked with a sharp sound, clean and cold. Jennings inhaled sharply, then exhaled like someone who had been punched in the gut. He didn't speak again. As the two officers escorted him toward the side exit, the room remained deathly still. No laughter now, no murmurs, just the shuffling of boots and the memory of what had just happened settling over everyone like dust on an old shelf. Lisa stood frozen, her hands still gripping the folder, her knuckles white. Across the room, the older man on the bench had risen, watching the scene unfold with quiet, stunned disbelief. He took off his hat slowly and held it to his chest, nodding once not to anyone in particular, just to the moment itself. Alexandria didn't watch Jennings leave. Her eyes stayed forward, not triumphant, not bitter, just steady like a stone that had finally stopped being pushed downhill. The receptionist, still behind the counter, finally stood up and stepped forward. "Chief Monroe," she said, her voice small. "Is there anything else we should do?" Alexandria turned to her, then glanced briefly at the officers still seated or standing unsure of what came next. "Yes," she said after a pause. "I want every report from today. I want surveillance footage preserved. And I want a full write-up on who was in this room and what they did or didn't do." The room stirred, shoulders straightened, pens picked up, and movement resumed. This time not out of habit but out of necessity. The old order had cracked, and no one could pretend otherwise. She walked to the front desk and leaned gently against the counter, wiping the last of the blood from her lip with a tissue someone handed her without speaking. The cut stung, but it wasn't the kind of pain that lingered. She'd had worse wounds deeper than skin, insults sharper than fists. What mattered now wasn't how it felt. What mattered was what came after. For the first time since she'd entered that building, Alexandria let her eyes scan the space without restraint. She saw the badge numbers. She saw the corners where people had once stood tall, and now hunched slightly. She saw the weight of shame beginning to settle in, not because of her authority, but because of their silence. It wasn't personal, it was structural, and it would take more than one arrest to dismantle it. Still, she had taken the first step. Outside the glass doors, the afternoon light had shifted. The clouds that had hung heavy earlier had thinned, letting streaks of golden sun filter down across the front walk. Through the windows, she could see a few pedestrians, slowing, watching the scene unfold through the glass with curiosity, some even with recognition. One of the younger officers walked quietly up to her side. He didn't say much, just stood there a moment before asking, "Do you still want to meet with HR?" Alexandria gave him a long look, then smiled faintly. "I think we've already had our first team meeting." He let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding, then nodded and walked away. She turned back toward the lobby where chairs had been pushed out of place and papers lay scattered from the earlier chaos. Without instruction, someone began to clean up. Another officer returned a bench to the wall. A quiet efficiency replaced the earlier tension. And slowly, piece by piece, the room began to breathe again. Alexandria didn't rush. She stood still for a moment longer, watching the light shift across the tile, catching on the brass badge she now wore openly. It wasn't pride she felt, at least not the simple kind. It was something harder to name, something earned through endurance, a kind of rootedness, a knowing. And as the door to the main office slowly closed behind the last echo of Sergeant Jennings' boots, she finally let herself exhale. For several long seconds, no one in the room seemed capable of movement. The officers near the exit froze mid-step, files still in hand, and the ones seated at their desks sat upright, back stiff, as if held there by invisible hands. Even the persistent humming of the vending machine seemed quieter now, as though the machines themselves had caught wind of what had just unfolded. Alexandria stood at the center of it all, not towering, not theatrical, just present in a way that made the room bend around her without her needing to raise her voice. Her eyes swept across the lobby, catching every flinch, every averted gaze, every pale face that had once been colored with laughter or indifference. One officer dropped his pen. Another stepped back, as if distancing himself from the memory of what he'd said only moments ago. They weren't just watching a woman reclaim authority. They were witnessing the precise moment the floor beneath their arrogance gave way, leaving them suspended in a kind of moral freefall. The truth had a weight that no one could deny anymore, and its center of gravity now rested squarely on her shoulders. Jennings, now cuffed and held between two officers, muttered again, but this time it wasn't anger, it was desperation. This wasn't supposed to happen, he mumbled, his eyes darting around the room like a man drowning in disbelief. I didn't know who she was. No one told me. The words felt brittle in the air, like old paper crumbling in his mouth. He wasn't appealing to anyone in particular, just speaking into the void, hoping someone somewhere might grab onto the story he was trying to spin. But the silence that followed was unkind. Lisa, still holding the open folder with Alexandria's appointment paperwork, finally lowered her arms, the papers trembling slightly in her hands. Her voice cracked softly as she spoke more to herself than anyone else. It's all here. She's been on the books for 3 days. It was sent to everyone. I even posted it on the bulletin board. She looked at the wall behind her, where a small, curled paper hung half-covered by a holiday fundraiser flyer. No one had read it. No one had cared to. The mayor's liaison, who had just entered the room minutes before, stood motionless near the doorway, her mouth open as she tried to process what she had walked into. She looked at Alexandria, eyes wide, with something that hovered between sympathy and fear. "Chief Monroe," she began, but Alexandria lifted a hand gently, just enough to stop the sentence before it left her lips completely. "Not now," she said quietly. "This moment doesn't belong to excuses. It belongs to consequences." She turned back to face the remaining officers, her gaze steady, not accusatory but exacting. "If any of you laughed, mocked, or stood silent when that happened," she said slowly, "I will remember. And if any of you think your silence makes you safe, you're mistaken. This department is done hiding behind rank or habit." Her voice never wavered, but its calmness hit like a storm rolling in from the horizon, quiet, wide, and undeniable. Several officers lowered their eyes. Others looked straight ahead, afraid to blink. One tried to open his mouth but couldn't seem to find the words. In the far corner, the young black officer, who had been quiet all morning, finally exhaled a slow, shaky breath, like someone surfacing after holding it far too long. Jennings, now visibly sweating, turned to the officer on his left. "Come on, you know me," he whispered hoarsely. "I trained half the people in this building." The officer's grip on his arm tightened ever so slightly, but he said nothing. There was nothing left to say. The handcuffs clinked softly as the two officers led Jennings down the hallway, past the quiet stairs, past the officers who now seemed smaller than before, their shadows pulling back from the edges of the room. The sound of his boots on the tile floor was the only sound for several seconds, like the ticking of a clock no one wanted to hear. Alexandria turned slowly and walked toward the center of the lobby, where the morning had begun, her steps silent but sure. Her posture hadn't changed, not stiff, not confrontational, just solid, in a way that made the whole space feel newly defined. One officer moved aside without needing to be asked. Another offered her a tissue from a desk drawer, his hand shaking slightly as he extended it. She accepted it with a small nod, wiping the blood that had dried at the corner of her mouth, with the quiet grace of someone who had long since learned how to carry pain without letting it define her. At the reception desk, the young woman who had ignored her earlier now stood straight, her face pale, her fingers fidgeting with the edge of her keyboard. "Chief, I didn't know," she said, in a whisper, eyes wide with remorse. Alexandria looked at her, and for the first time since the confrontation, her expression softened, but not entirely. "That's the problem," she replied gently. "Too many people didn't want to know." Then she turned back to face the room one final time, her voice calm but carrying. "Get me the files on this morning's activities. Lock down all hallway footage. And I want every officer on duty to write an incident report by the end of the day, typed, signed, and submitted to my office. No omissions, no edits." There was no bark in her tone, no raised voice, only finality. Orders that didn't need to be shouted to be followed. Around her, the department began to move. Not quickly, not confidently, but with the careful motions of people who had just seen the curtain pulled back. Some started typing. Others disappeared into side rooms. No one questioned her authority now. And no one looked at each other the same way they had before. Outside the building, the sky had cleared. The early haze had lifted, revealing a soft blue horizon that glowed faintly in the mid-morning sun. A few civilians stood across the street, squinting toward the station windows, their expressions puzzled, curious. One woman lifted her phone and snapped a picture through the glass. The moment was no longer private. It never had been. Alexandria stood still for a moment, her back to the officers, her eyes focused on the sunlight breaking through the front doors. She wasn't thinking about what had happened. She was thinking about what came next. What justice actually looked like when stripped of ceremony and politics and rank, and how many rooms just like this one still waited to be cracked open. The floor beneath her feet felt solid. The walls around her were still familiar, but everything else had shifted. And the next breath she took tasted different, like something clean had just made its way into a place that had gone stale for far too long. The hallway leading to the side exit felt longer than usual, as if time itself had slowed to watch what was happening. The sound of Sergeant Jennings' boots against the polished tile echoed too loudly, a heavy rhythm that marked each step like a slow drumbeat in a funeral march. The two officers walking beside him kept their grips firm but restrained their faces blank, trying not to betray the storm of thoughts behind their eyes. The lobby they left behind was still reeling in the quiet aftermath, like the final hush, after a violent downpour, windows streaked with light silence, rippling like a lake just disturbed. Alexandria didn't move at first. She stood there, hands calmly clasped in front of her eyes, resting on the closed door through which Jennings had just been taken. Her face didn't show satisfaction or anger, only a solemn stillness, the kind that follows when justice finally exhales after holding its breath for too long. She could still feel the sharp ache where his fist had landed, not just the physical sting of the impact, but the deeper bruise of what it represented, a system that had long believed it could strike without consequence and carry on like nothing happened. A quiet voice broke the silence behind her. "Chief, are you okay?" It was Officer Santos, the younger of the two who had escorted Jennings out. His voice held a soft tremor, unsure whether to offer help or simply bear witness. Alexandria turned toward him slowly, her gaze steady, but something in her shoulders softened. "I'll be fine," she replied. "But thank you for asking." Santos nodded, then looked away quickly, his cheeks flushed with something like shame, though the shame wasn't his to carry. She walked back toward the front of the room, her heels tapping a gentle rhythm on the floor, more grounded now than assertive. Around her, officers shifted back into motion, not the casual bustle of earlier, but a different energy altogether, heavier, more deliberate. Papers were gathered, chairs, straightened, whispers exchanged in tones barely audible. No one dared meet her eyes for more than a second, but she saw them, saw the recognition settling in like morning fog across their features. It wasn't just about who she was anymore. It was about what she had just done, and what they hadn't. Reaching the front desk, Alexandria leaned slightly against the counter, letting her fingers graze the cool surface as she gathered her thoughts. Behind her, the older gentleman who had watched it all unfold now stood just a few feet away, still holding his hat close to his chest. "Ma'am," he said, softly voiced, gravelly with age, but full of something warm, "I've lived in this town for over 70 years, and I ain't never seen anyone stand up like that in this building." Alexandria turned to him and offered a small, tired smile. "Then maybe it's time we made that normal." The man nodded, once eyes glassy. "My name's Harold." He extended his hand, and she shook it gently, the gesture saying more than any speech could. "Thank you, Harold," she replied, "for waiting, and for watching." He squeezed her hand briefly before stepping back, then sat down again, more relaxed this time, as if something sacred had just been restored. The assistant Lisa hovered near the file cabinet, still clutching the folder she'd brought earlier. Her posture was tense, but her expression had changed from uncertainty to something like resolve. "Chief," she began, voice quieter than usual, "do you want me to call the mayor's office, or issue a statement?" Alexandria shook her head, not abruptly, but with clarity. "No statements. Not yet. Right now we need to focus on what's in here, not what's out there." Lisa nodded, and tucked the folder under her arm, her gaze falling briefly on the thin line of dried blood at the corner of Alexandria's mouth. She opened her mouth as if to say something else, but then thought better of it, and quietly walked away, disappearing down a side corridor with the door clicking softly behind her. The lobby began to shift again. Officers who had remained rooted to their spots slowly resumed their duties, one picking up the morning mail, another retrieving a clipboard from a filing tray. Yet the room felt altered, as if someone had turned down the volume on an old television, and for the first time people were actually listening. The shift wasn't loud. It was quiet and internal, the kind of change that settles into bone before it reaches behavior. Alexandria moved to the large window near the front entrance, and stood there a moment looking out. The sunlight had shifted from a harsh white to a softer golden hue, casting shadows across the parking lot, and illuminating the dust floating gently through the air inside. Outside, people passed by on the sidewalk, unaware of what had just taken place. Inside, another day, another hour, another rotation of the clock. But inside, everything felt slower, like the stillness that follows a storm no one saw coming. She exhaled deeply, allowing her shoulders to drop just slightly, not out of exhaustion, but out of release, the kind of breath that comes when something long held finally lets go. Her reflection in the window looked back at her eyes, still sharp, jaw still firm, but now with something quieter underneath. Not relief, not pride, just certainty. One of the patrol officers walked past her with a nod and muttered, "Hell of a first day, Chief." Alexandria didn't turn. She smiled slightly and replied, "I'd say it's about right." The officer chuckled once, then moved on, leaving her alone with her thoughts and the late morning sun streaking across the floor. And in that moment, Alexandria Monroe stood not just as the new police chief, but as a woman who had forced a reckoning without shouting, without violence, without begging to be seen. She had stood in her truth, and the room had shifted around it. She knew the real work was only just beginning. But for now, in the quiet aftermath, the building stood still listening, and she stood with it unshaken, unafraid, and finally undeniable. Alexandria stood near the door to the main office, her hand lightly resting on the metal frame, as the building behind her slowly began to find its rhythm again. The earlier chaos had settled into something quieter now, controlled, cautious, heavy with awareness. The voices that once echoed through the hall with careless laughter were hushed, lowered to respectful tones, as if the walls themselves might be listening. She could feel the tension still lingering in the air, not the kind that came from confrontation, but the quiet strain of people who had just seen something they could no longer unsee. Across the room, an officer stepped into view holding a manila folder, his eyes flicking upward just long enough to meet hers before dropping back to the papers in his hands. He passed by without a word, but his posture had shifted, more upright, more deliberate, more aware of the ground he was walking on. Alexandria took a slow breath, feeling the bruise on her cheek pulse beneath the surface, a dull reminder that power, even when misused, leaves marks that don't always fade with apologies. She moved back toward the center of the lobby, where several chairs had been pushed out of place during the earlier confrontation. Without fanfare, she reached down and righted one of them, placing it neatly beside the others, her hand brushing across the cold metal armrest like she was wiping away a trace of what had happened. The simple act felt like a reclamation not of control but of peace. She didn't need the room to forget. She just needed it to begin again. Behind her, the door to the hallway clicked open, and one of the senior officers stepped out. He was a man in his 50s, graying at the temples, with the kind of face that carried years of habit more than malice. "Chief Monroe," he said, clearing his throat before continuing, "we've secured the footage, all angles. It's being backed up now and sent to internal review." Alexandria nodded, not with praise but with acknowledgement. "Thank you, Captain. Make sure it's also sent directly to my office." He nodded quickly and left without further comment, his footsteps fading into the carpeted corridor. The small things mattered now, the paperwork, the footage, the reports, not just for procedure, but for memory, for truth, for the people who would one day ask what was done and why it mattered. Alexandria knew this moment would be dissected in meetings, debated in newsrooms, and whispered about in locker rooms. But the real work wasn't about how the story would be told. It was about who would have the courage to live differently because of it. Near the side wall, a bulletin board held notices that had become background noise to most training schedules, birthday announcements, department fundraisers. At the bottom corner, tucked beneath a curling flyer for the annual holiday potluck, was the memo announcing her appointment. Alexandria stepped closer, lifted the flyer, and stared at her own name, typed plainly in black ink. Alexandria Monroe, Chief of Police. Effective immediately. No photograph, no introduction. Just a line of text surrounded by coupons for barbecue ribs and reminders for CPR recertification. She didn't feel anger as she looked at it. She felt clarity. They hadn't ignored her out of oversight. They had chosen not to see her, because acknowledging her presence would have required a change in how they understood their own. But that era was over. Change had already entered the room, bruised but upright, quiet but undeniable. Behind her, the glass front doors opened, and a gust of fresh air moved through the lobby, carrying with it the faint scent of spring, the sharpness of cut grass, the warmth of sun on concrete. A civilian couple entered cautiously, pausing at the threshold, unsure whether they were interrupting something sacred. Alexandria turned and offered them a nod, subtle but welcoming, and the man removed his hat instinctively, as if passing into a church. "We just needed to drop off some paperwork," he said softly. Didn't realize his words trailed off as he caught sight of the officers standing straighter the room, quieter than any police station should be at that hour. "You're welcome to come in," Alexandria replied, her voice calm but steady. "We're open. Just a busy morning." The woman gave her a polite smile, her gaze lingering a moment longer than necessary, perhaps recognizing something beneath the badge and blazer. They passed by without another word, leaving behind a faint echo of normalcy in their wake. Alexandria walked to her office, then not with ceremony but with purpose, closing the door gently behind her as she stepped into the room that had only hours ago felt like a stranger's space. Now, it felt lived in, claimed, real. The blinds were half drawn, casting soft lines of shadow across the floor. A desk lamp hummed quietly. She pulled out the chair and sat down slowly, feeling the weight of the morning settle into her bones like the slow ache that follows adrenaline's departure. She reached for the notepad on her desk and wrote one sentence at the top of the page, "Begin where the damage was done." It wasn't a slogan or a headline. It was a roadmap for the department, for herself, for anyone watching who wondered whether real leadership could begin in silence and still shift the ground beneath injustice. She tapped the pen against the paper once, twice, then set it down. And as she leaned back in the chair, letting the quiet surround her for the first time all day, Alexandria allowed herself one small moment of stillness. Not to rest, but to remember why she had come, not to punish or to provoke, but to lead. Not from behind a podium or with rehearsed words, but by showing that justice, when embodied, doesn't shout. It stands, it listens, and it endures. Outside her office window, the wind stirred a branch against the glass. A simple, soft sound, repetitive, persistent grounding. She closed her eyes briefly, then opened them again, ready to write the next line. By early afternoon, the precinct had quieted into a tense hum, the kind that comes after a storm, when everyone's still figuring out whether to move or stay still. No one was laughing anymore. The energy that once pulsed through the halls with casual arrogance now hung low and dense, pressing into every room like a fog that wouldn't lift. Reports were being typed with shaking hands, phones answered with clipped voices, and the clatter of keys and boots had taken on a rhythm more reverent than routine. The building felt changed, not in its structure but in the air between its walls, the invisible space where culture lives, and if necessary begins to crumble. Alexandria remained in her office, the blinds drawn halfway, allowing thin ribbons of sunlight to spill onto the desk where a growing stack of documents waited. Her face, though composed, held the weight of everything that had happened that morning, every insult, every silence, every blow absorbed with dignity, but not forgotten. She didn't pace or fidget. She sat still, pen in hand, reading the preliminary incident statements that were slowly being submitted. Each page held fragments of truth, some more honest than others, but all revealing in their own way. Some officers described the moment Jennings struck her with clinical detachment, others with a tremor of guilt, and a few had offered nothing but procedural facts, hiding behind the safety of the neutral voice. She marked each with a small red check when finished, not as a judgment but as acknowledgement. I've read you. I see you. I know what you're saying and what you're not. A soft knock on the door broke her concentration. It wasn't rushed or hesitant, but respectful, like someone who didn't want to enter without permission. "Come in," she said, her voice clear but low. The door opened slowly, and Officer Malik Jenkins stepped inside, his posture, straight eyes forward, but his hands clasped too tightly to hide the nervousness underneath. "Chief," he began, then paused. "I just wanted to say, I should have stepped in earlier. I saw it happening. I knew it wasn't right." His voice was quiet, but heavy, like each word cost him something. Alexandria met his gaze, then gestured to the chair across from her. "Sit," she said gently. He did, shoulders stiff, but breathing a little easier once seated. "You're not the only one who froze," she added, "but you're one of the few who came to say something about it." Malik looked down at his hands, then back up. "I didn't know if I'd be fired. Or worse." "And yet you're here," she replied. "That counts for something." They sat in silence for a moment, the ticking of the office clock filling the room like a metronome, marking the time between fear and integrity. "What's going to happen now?" he finally asked. It was a question weighted with more than policy. It carried the anxiety of everyone who had ever wanted to do the right thing but lived in a system that punished it. "We rebuild," she said quietly. "Not just policies, but people. And that starts with truth, even the uncomfortable kind." Malik nodded, and though his shoulders didn't relax completely, a new steadiness entered his expression, the kind that comes when someone decides to stay in the fire instead of walking away. "If you need help with anything, training, outreach, even talking to the rookies I'm in," he added. "I don't want to just wait around for the next thing to blow up." Alexandria smiled softly, not wide but real. "Good," she said. "Because we need more people who aren't just here to wear the badge, but to honor what it means." As Malik stood to leave, she watched him walk out with a slower, more deliberate pace, like someone who had finally decided which side of the line they wanted to stand on. After the door closed behind him, Alexandria leaned back slightly in her chair, letting the tension in her back ease just enough to feel the room breathe again. Outside, her office footsteps passed by, measured, careful but less aimless than before. Down the hallway, the conference room was being prepared for an emergency staff meeting. The chairs had been rearranged into a circle rather than rows, a small but intentional signal that this wasn't going to be a lecture, it was going to be a reckoning. Officers would be expected to speak, to listen, to be present, not as enforcers, but as individuals now required to reflect on their place in the system they served. Alexandria had no illusions that one meeting would undo years of culture, but it had to begin somewhere. Not behind a podium, not in a memo, but face to face, in a space that dared to be uncomfortable. Back in her office, the hum of the building softened for a moment, replaced by the sound of wind brushing against the windows, gentle, persistent, like fingers tapping to be let in. Alexandria looked out at the narrow stretch of sky beyond the blinds, pale blue and cloudless, a quiet backdrop for a day that had been anything but. She thought of Jennings not as the man in handcuffs, but as a symbol of a deeper sickness, the kind that hides behind seniority, charm, and procedural language. The kind that spreads not through orders, but through the things people let slide, laugh off, or look away from. She thought of the officers still sitting at their desks, wondering if they were next to fall or next to speak. She thought of the citizens who walked through the station doors, unsure of whether they'd be believed or belittled. And she thought of every quiet moment in every station like this one, where dignity had been swallowed to keep the peace and where silence had been mistaken for safety. Then, with her pen still in hand and the file stack growing steadily beside her, she wrote one final sentence on the notepad beside her desk. "Every culture has a tipping point. Today was ours. And as the clock ticked forward and the building prepared for its first honest conversation in years, she folded the note once, slipped it into her desk drawer, and stood to join them, not as a savior but as a mirror they could no longer avoid. The conference room was unusually quiet for a space that had hosted so many years of barking orders, offhand jokes, and heavy boots shuffling through briefings. Today, there were no projectors humming, no bullet-point agendas printed out, no clinking of coffee cups against scratched tables. Instead, the room had been arranged into a large circle. No front, no podium, no protective corners to hide behind, just equal seats under the same buzzing ceiling light. It was a small but intentional decision, one that Alexandria had made herself, knowing full well that the shape of a space could influence the honesty that unfolded inside it. Officers filed in slowly, each one looking for a chair, but also for a cue on how to act, how to sit, how to carry themselves, now that the rules had clearly shifted. Some still had the stiff posture of resistance clinging to their shoulders, while others moved with the heavy steps of people unsure if they still belonged. A few eyes lifted toward Alexandria as she entered, standing at the doorway just long enough for them to see she wasn't going to command from the center. Instead, she walked to an empty chair and took a seat like everyone else, level, quiet, and ready. For a long moment, no one spoke. The room swelled with unspoken thoughts, the kind that sit behind teeth for months, sometimes years, waiting for a safe space to breathe. The ticking of the wall clock filled the silence, marking each second that someone chose not to be first. Then Officer Chen, a woman in her 40s with a steady voice and tired eyes, leaned forward slightly, hands clasped in front of her knees. I didn't laugh, she began, not looking at anyone in particular. But I didn't stop it either. Her words fell into the center of the circle with a kind of honest weight, and for the first time that day the silence cracked, not in disruption but in release. Alexandria met her eyes briefly, then nodded once, giving space but not judgment. "Thank you," she said softly, then let the silence return, not as punishment but as invitation. Captain Ellis, one of the longest-serving white officers in the room, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. His hand rubbed the back of his neck, like he was trying to loosen something he couldn't name. "I've been here 22 years, he muttered. "And I can't say I haven't heard worse. I can't say I haven't let worse slide." His voice cracked at the edge of the sentence, and he didn't try to hide it. We told ourselves it was just how things were, that it wasn't our place to correct it. Whose place was it then? Someone asked quietly. No one looked to see who said it. They didn't need to. A young recruit, fresh out of academy, face still uncreased by time, lifted his eyes. "I was scared," he admitted. "Not of the chief, not really. I was scared of what it would mean if I stood up. Scared I'd be seen as disloyal to the people who trained me." His voice was small, but it carried. "But now I realize loyalty isn't silence." The words hung there for a moment, catching the room in their grip. Alexandria didn't interrupt. She let it breathe, let them sit in what had been said without rushing toward closure or apology. This wasn't about checking a box or moving on. It was about sitting in the discomfort long enough for it to stop being foreign. "I taught Jennings how to process arrests," said Officer Reardon, his hands folded on his lap, his stare locked on the floor. "He used to say things that made me cringe, but I laughed sometimes just to keep the peace. I thought maybe it wasn't my job to fix him. I thought maybe the system would sort itself out." He looked up slowly. But it didn't. And now this department is national news because we all let him feel too safe doing the wrong thing. Alexandria leaned forward slightly, elbows on her knees, her voice steady but warm. "What happened wasn't just about one man. It was about what we tolerated to keep from rocking the boat." She paused, scanning the room, letting her words settle. "But if the boat is carrying people into harm, it deserves to be rocked." No one clapped, no one cheered, but no one looked away either, because there are some truths that don't need applause, they only need to be said clearly and without hesitation. Someone passed around notepads, simple unlined sheets for anyone who wanted to write what they couldn't yet say aloud. A few began scribbling heads, bowed hands, moving fast. Others just sat still, breathing a little deeper, sitting a little straighter. It wasn't transformation, but it was shift. And shift matters. Outside the window, the sun was beginning to dip lower, sending long shadows across the floor, softening everything with golden light. The blinds swayed gently in the breeze from the air vent, a low whir blending with the hum of thought that now filled the room. There was no grand conclusion, no final verdict handed down. Just people beginning to see one another clearly, maybe for the first time in years. As the meeting began to close, Alexandria stood not abruptly but naturally, like someone rising not to declare, but to continue. "Change doesn't start in headlines," she said quietly. "It starts in rooms like this, with voices like yours." And with that, she stepped back, not out of the circle but into it where the rest of them now sat. And for the first time that day, no one watched her as a symbol. They watched her as someone standing with them, not above them. And that in itself was enough. In a quiet office on the second floor of City Hall, a group of senior officials sat around a long table, their faces drawn, not with anger, but with something deeper, an uneasy mix of recognition and regret. The blinds were half closed, casting faint lines of sunlight across the surface of polished wood, where coffee cups, yellow legal pads, and printed incident reports lay like evidence at a trial. No one reached for the sugar or stirred their coffee. The atmosphere was too heavy, the implications too real. A large television screen on the far wall displayed frozen security footage of the exact moment Sergeant Jennings' fist made contact with Alexandria's jaw, grainy, brutal, unmistakable. "I don't need to see that again," one official muttered, turning away and rubbing his temple as if the motion could erase what they all knew. Another leaned forward, fingers pressed together tightly. "We've reviewed the footage from 3 different angles. We've taken witness statements. There's no ambiguity here." His voice was calm, but his hands trembled slightly as he picked up the disciplinary folder that now bore Jennings' name in bold black ink. Across the table, the city's legal advisor adjusted her glasses, scanning a printed list of prior complaints, small infractions, offhand remarks, nothing that had triggered a formal reprimand, but now read like breadcrumbs that had been ignored too long. "This wasn't a moment of rage," she said slowly. "It was a culmination. We enabled it, and it grew under our watch." Someone sighed heavily, a low sound that filled the silence like thunder behind glass. "Do we make a public statement?" another asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Or do we wait until media requests start pouring in?" The mayor, seated at the head of the table, looked down at his hands and finally spoke. "We don't wait. The people already know. And if they don't now, they will by nightfall." No one disagreed. They didn't need to. Outside the conference room, phones buzzed, screens lit up, and an unease had begun to spread through the upper floors of the city administration building. Word had moved fast, not because it was leaked, but because people talked, and when justice shifts visibly, people listen in ways they hadn't before. Staffers whispered in elevators, clerks watched the footage from their phones on lunch breaks, and long-retired officers sent quiet texts to former colleagues with messages like, "You seeing this?" or simply, "About damn time." Back at the station, the official letter of termination was already being typed, the HR department working in near silence, as Alexandria's presence filled the building like a new current in an old river. The decision to fire Jennings wasn't debated. It didn't require a vote. His actions had crossed too many lines to be softened by seniority or friendship. There would be no transfer, no administrative leave, no vague phrasing about retirement. It was over, clean, direct, irreversible. Jennings, now seated in a holding room in the basement of the station, stared blankly at the wall, his uniform still rumpled from the struggle, his hands resting limply in his lap. He wasn't yelling, he wasn't arguing. He was quiet now, as if the enormity of what had happened had finally silenced the voice that once filled so many rooms with superiority and contempt. He asked for no lawyer. He made no excuses. Whether out of guilt or disbelief, he sat still, shrinking in a space he once ruled. Captain Ellis stepped into the room with the signed termination notice in hand, his expression unreadable but his movements careful. "Kyle," he said, using the first name not out of friendship but because formalities no longer mattered. Jennings looked up, his eyes, bloodshot, unfocused. "I never thought it would end like this," he said quietly, his voice raw from hours of silence. "I gave this place everything." "No," Ellis replied, setting the envelope on the table in front of him. "You took everything you wanted. And now it's time to let it go." Jennings didn't respond. He didn't open the envelope. He just looked at it like it was written in a language he no longer understood. Outside the room, reporters had begun to gather near the front entrance of the station, their cameras angled high, their microphones poised, waiting for someone to confirm what the community had already guessed. Social media posts had spread like wildfire, some with raw clips of the confrontation, others with quotes from Alexandria's earlier command. "Arrest him now" was already trending, a phrase that had become both a demand and a symbol. Protesters had started to form small groups on the sidewalk, not with chants or anger, but with signs that read, "We believe her and no one is above the badge." Among them were former victims of police abuse, family members of the unheard and older residents who had never dared to believe they'd live to see such a day. Inside, Alexandria was meeting with a small group of community leaders in her office, pastors, educators, youth organizers, all of whom had seen the news and arrived without being summoned. "You didn't just change the department today," one pastor said quietly. "You changed what people believe is possible in this town." Alexandria nodded, once her voice quiet but sure. "This is only the beginning. There's still more to clean up. A lot more." The organizer beside her, a woman in her early 30s, with a clipboard and a tired smile, replied, "We're ready to help. Just tell us where to start." And outside the glass window behind her, the city's flag waved gently in the wind, catching the soft light of a sky no longer gray, but streaked with late afternoon gold. Change hadn't come with banners or sirens. It had come with truth, spoken plainly, with actions taken in real time, with the weight of consequences finally falling where they belonged. And as the sun lowered over Hampton, a city long buried under old power and quiet wrongs, the streets did not roar with celebration, nor shake with unrest. They simply breathed, as if for the first time in a long time they could. By the time the sun dipped low behind the courthouse dome, casting long shadows over the west-facing windows of the precinct, the building had entered a strange kind of quiet, neither tense nor calm, but reflective, like a place holding its breath after something irreversible. The day had reshaped not only its rhythm, but its very identity, and those who moved through its corridors now did so with a different kind of awareness. Shoulders, lower glances, more thoughtful silence, no longer a shield, but a mirror. The weight of Jennings' fall still clung to the air, not as gossip or spectacle, but as a warning too loud to ignore. Alexandria walked the length of the second-floor hallway slowly, her boots tapping softly on the polished linoleum, her hand brushing the wall once as if anchoring herself. It had been a long day, and though her face remained composed, there was a quiet fatigue in her posture, the kind earned not from noise but from holding back the need to shout. As she passed each closed door, she could feel conversations unfolding behind them, whispers between partners, unspoken recalibrations of power, subtle reckonings about how far the silence had gone before someone finally broke it. At the end of the hallway, she stopped in front of a framed photograph mounted near the elevator, a group shot of the department's leadership team taken 5 years ago. Jennings stood in the center, broad-shouldered and smug, his arms folded across his chest, like a man convinced of his permanence. Around him, a mix of familiar faces, some still here, some long gone, smiled into the lens with the easy confidence of people who had never had to explain their presence. Alexandria stared at it for a long moment, her reflection layered faintly over the glass, and in that double image she saw both who they had been and who she had become. Downstairs, the front lobby had emptied out. The reporters had gone, the community leaders had returned to their neighborhoods, and the uniformed officers had retreated into their respective corners of the building. Only Lisa remained at the front desk, organizing the visitor log with robotic precision, her hands moving efficiently though her eyes were distant. Alexandria approached quietly, not wanting to startle her. Lisa looked up and straightened. "Chief," she said, voice small but steady. "Everything's signed. HR sent over the formal release papers for everyone who was placed on administrative leave." Alexandria nodded, taking the folder Lisa offered. "Thank you," she said. "You've held a lot today." Lisa hesitated, then added, "So have you." There was a moment between them, silent, honest, two women, standing in a place that had never made room for either of them both, now holding it in ways no one expected. Alexandria gave her a slight smile, not wide, but real, then turned and walked back toward the offices with the folder tucked under her arm. Her next stop was the break room, where the department's heart usually beat the loudest microwaves, humming coffee, brewing casual banter, filling the corners. But today, the room was empty, its tables wiped, clean the coffee pot cold. She stood in the doorway for a moment, taking in the space where so many blind eyes had gathered. She remembered the first time she'd stepped in here under cover, the way conversations had halted mid-joke, the way laughter turned cautious as soon as she'd walked in. That memory had teeth, and it still stung, but now it had shape, context, consequence, clarity. She walked to the far table where a stack of old department newsletters sat in a plastic tray. The one on top was from last month, its cover story, a celebration of Jennings' years of service complete with staged photos and quotes about leadership. Alexandria picked it up and stared at the headline, "The Steady Hand of Hampton Sergeant Jennings' Legacy of Strength." She read the words once, then again, then slowly folded the paper in half and placed it back in the tray, not with anger but with the finality of someone closing a door that should have been shut long ago. In the back hallway near the evidence room, she passed Officer Jenkins, the same young man who had hesitated to intervene but had later spoken up. He looked up when he saw her, then stopped, unsure whether to speak. She paused, giving him space, not expecting anything but offering presence. "I've been thinking about what I saw," he said, his voice low but grounded. "Not just today, but everything before it. I think I knew it was wrong. I just didn't know how to name it." Alexandria nodded gently, offering no judgment, only understanding. "Most people don't," she replied. "Until someone else forces them to." He looked at her eyes, clearer, now steadier. "You forced all of us to." She didn't respond. She just held his gaze a second longer, then moved on, leaving behind not a speech, not a lesson, just a quiet standard. The day finally ended in her office, the door shut behind her, the blinds drawn against the fading light. She sat at her desk without turning on the lamp, letting the soft twilight fill the room with a kind of hush that felt earned. The reports were still stacked beside her, the emails unanswered, but for the first time in hours, she allowed herself a moment of stillness, not to review or prepare, but to feel. She thought of the people who had watched her rise today, not as a dramatic performance, but as something steady, painful, and necessary. She thought of the officers who had avoided her eyes in the hallway, the citizens who had stood outside with signs but no shouting, the quiet reshuffling of loyalty happening inside rooms she might never see. She thought of every young black girl who would hear the story, not from a headline, but from someone who had seen it unfold, and maybe, just maybe, would believe she could hold power without asking permission. The room had darkened now, the last traces of sunlight gone, replaced by the soft glow of a street lamp outside, casting gentle patterns through the blinds. Alexandria leaned back in her chair, closed her eyes for a brief moment, and let the silence wrap around her like a blanket, not empty, but full of everything that had been confronted, and everything still waiting. And when she finally opened her eyes again, there was no speech forming on her lips, no grand conclusion in her heart, just a quiet, grounded truth pulsing in her chest like a promise. This place will never be the same again. As the sun disappeared fully behind the line of distant trees, casting the town in its familiar early evening quiet, the lights inside the precinct took on a softer, almost domestic tone. Fluorescents that had once felt harsh now flickered gently across desks, still cluttered with unfinished reports, lukewarm coffee, and a few small reminders that life still went on half-eaten granola bars, a crumpled sports schedule, back the blue mug now out of place. The station hadn't emptied, but it had quieted, and that quiet was not emptiness. It was the aftersound of something real, the echo of a moment too large to ignore and too sharp to forget. Alexandria stood in front of the glass doors facing the street, her silhouette outlined by the street lamp just outside. Through the panes, she could see a few late passers-by, some on their way home from work, others standing farther back in pairs or small groups, murmuring softly to each other while glancing toward the station. The protest signs were gone now, but the feeling lingered like an aftertaste, or the hum in your bones after music stops. They weren't watching in anger anymore. They were watching in wait, curious, uncertain, maybe even hopeful. Behind her, the clack of low heels echoed down the hallway, measured and familiar. Lisa's voice came gently but clearly. "Chief, the mayor's office is asking if you'll be attending the press briefing tomorrow." Alexandria didn't turn right away. She let the silence stretch for a breath or two before replying. "I'll go," she said, "but I won't be reciting anything they write for me." Lisa gave a small chuckle, not of amusement but appreciation. They wouldn't expect anything less. Then after a pause, "You want me to get someone to drive you home?" Alexandria turned at last, her eyes tired but still alert. "No," she said. "I think I'll walk." Lisa nodded slowly, understanding what wasn't being said. "It's been a day," she said, gently. "It has," Alexandria replied, and with a slight smile that reached only halfway to her eyes, she added, "But it's been the right kind of day." She walked through the front doors without ceremony, the chill in the air wrapping around her like a coat she didn't mind wearing. The sidewalks were quiet now, but not empty. As she passed the corner of Main and Douglas, an older man sitting on a bench looked up from his newspaper and gave her a small nod. "Evenin', Chief," he said, and the way he said it plain, unforced, like he meant every syllable, carried more than any official statement ever could. She returned the nod with quiet sincerity, the gesture between them needing no extra meaning. Her boots tapped against the pavement in a rhythm that matched the calm inside her chest. It wasn't pride she felt. It wasn't relief. It was something harder to name, something rooted solid, forged from years of being overlooked, spoken over, and yet never moved. The events of the day hadn't made her stronger. They had only revealed the strength that was already there. A block down, she passed a corner store where two teenagers leaned against the brick wall, sharing a bag of chips and laughing under their breath. One of them paused mid-sentence when he recognized her, his laughter tapering into silence. He elbowed his friend, and the two of them stood a little straighter, their expressions shifting from surprise to something quieter, maybe respect, maybe something else. "Good evening, ma'am," one of them said, uncertain but sincere. Alexandria gave them a slight smile. "You boys stay out of trouble," she said softly, her voice warm but not patronizing. "The town's watching." They nodded quickly, and as she walked away, she could hear one of them whisper, "That's her." She didn't need them to know her name. She needed them to know the standard. That power could look like them. That leadership could be black and female and firm, without cruelty. That justice didn't have to come with a gun or a shout, but with presence, with clarity, and with unshakable direction. By the time she reached her street, the wind had picked up, slightly rustling the oak trees that lined the edge of the sidewalk. Porch lights flickered on one by one, casting long golden streaks across familiar yards, each one quiet in its own rhythm. She walked up the steps to her house, paused at the top, and looked back, not because she doubted, but because she was learning how to witness her own presence. She reached into her coat pocket, pulled out the precinct key she hadn't yet clipped to her personal ring, and held it in her hand for a long moment. It was heavier than she expected, not physically but symbolically. It carried decades of exclusion, silence, tension, and unearned authority. Now in her palm it held something new, something earned. She unlocked the door and stepped inside the warmth of the home, greeting her like a memory she hadn't visited in days. There was no crowd waiting, no applause, just quiet floors, a humming heater, and the subtle scent of lavender rising from a candle she'd forgotten she'd left burning that morning. She hung her coat, removed her boots, and moved to the kitchen where a glass of water and the stillness of her own space became the final punctuation on the longest sentence of her life. She didn't turn on the television. She didn't check the headlines. She didn't scroll to see what was being said about her now. She knew that what mattered had already been written, not in the press but in the minds of those who had watched, witnessed, and decided to change. And as she stood there, leaning quietly against the counter, the city outside, still turning, still breathing, still watching, Alexandria Monroe allowed herself a moment to close her eyes and hold the silence. Not because she was done, but because she had arrived. Sometimes the strongest voice in the room is the one that doesn't yell but stands firm in the face of injustice. Alexandria Monroe didn't demand respect with volume or threats. She earned it through quiet courage, unwavering dignity, and the power of presence. Her story reminds us that it's never too late to stand up, not just for ourselves, but for what's right. Whether you're in your 30s or your 70s, life will keep offering moments where silence feels safer, but silence doesn't bring change. Respect is not something we wait to be given. It's something we build with every choice we make. And sometimes the most important legacy we leave is not in our victories, but in how we carry ourselves when the world isn't watching. So if you're listening to this and thinking it's too late to speak up, to shift direction, to challenge old ways, remember, change often begins in the quiet moments when someone decides enough is enough. And maybe, just maybe, that someone is you. If this story moved you even just a little, take a moment to let us know. Hit that like button, share your thoughts in the comments, and, most importantly, don't forget to subscribe for more stories that speak truth, strength, and second chances. Your support helps us keep bringing powerful voices like this one to light.